Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 12.2, Describe the Situational and Social Causes of Aggression for PSY 235, Social Psychology. Frustration aggression theory is one of the earlier models that social psychologists proposed to help us understand how aggression might work in humans. The initial assumption is that frustration is sort of a readiness state. It's a perception that you're being stopped on your way to a goal. Something interferes. We all can relate to that. We've all experienced frustration probably more than once a day, right? And this theory suggests that frustration at a goal being blocked, the original version of the theory was that frustration would lead to aggression. Now, what's noticed, though, in the early research was that frustration doesn't always lead to aggression. There are a lot of different responses to frustration. Sometimes frustration just leaves people mildly dissatisfied. They may shrug their shoulders and go on with their day and ignore it. Some people find frustration to be a challenge, so they'll double their efforts and try harder. Still others, frustration may make them angry, and then they're in a readiness state for performing aggressive behaviors. So the original theory really just posited there was no red block in the middle of the model, as you can see in the illustration, but it had to be updated because humans are complicated. We don't always respond to frustration with a preparation for aggression. So the argument was you had to be angry in order to then translate that frustration into an aggressive act. They argue that the theorists in this area argue that several things can make frustration more likely, and that can be things like how close you were to getting to the goal, how big a delay you're experiencing, how unexpected is the frustration. If you're really close to your goal, if you don't expect to be frustrated on the way to your goal, that can make you angry. And if you perceive that another person intentionally has inflicted frustration on you, that can make you angry too. So in some cases, provocation is a piece of the puzzle. In other cases, it's just the unexpected nature of being frustrated. So anytime you're flying, you're going to an airport, and if you expect there to be big delays, if you expect to be frustrated here and there, then you're less likely to get angry about it, and you're less likely to behave aggressively. If, however, you're really close to your flight time and all of a sudden the delay sign goes up and your flight has been delayed for hours, you don't expect it to happen, that's when people get really angry at the airport, right? Some social situations that are predictive of aggression, since we know that frustration isn't the only thing that predicts aggressiveness, we need to look at some other things. What kind of circumstances can turn frustration into aggression? Well, in some cases, it depends on who you're up against. So, I'll go back to the airport example. Usually the target of our anger when we are angry at the airport is the representative standing behind the desk who's dealing with you in the line trying to get on your plane. That individual is a relatively powerless cog in a great big engine that is the airline. They really have no control over anything that you're experiencing, but they're right there. So if we evaluate that person, they're a handy target, they're pretty powerless, there's nothing they can really do to you, you may go after them with your anger and aggression. Some things that we evaluate before frustration can turn into an actual aggressive act, or that can modify the type of aggressive act, is how big and strong the person is that you're coming up against. How likely is that person to retaliate? How close is that person to you physically? Like, it's a whole lot easier to vent your aggression online or vent your aggression on the phone than it is face to face with a real live human being. especially if that person is also likely to retaliate against you. One of the studies, excuse me, that was done in this area involved a Confederate who, from the participants' point of view, unwittingly sabotaged the problem solving of his team, and that creates a frustration situation for his teammates, because when they were looking at the measurable level of aggression, if it was because his hearing aid stopped working and he missed a cue, they didn't blame him for that. It wasn't in his own control. If, however, that excuse wasn't built in, that explanation wasn't built in, he becomes the target of everybody else's frustration. If people can understand the frustration, if they know it's coming, if they see the frustration factor as being legitimate and unintentional, aggression tendencies tend to go down. They tend to be reduced. Some of the variables that we also look at when we're trying to understand situational factors that are related to aggression are how we make sense of being provoked and how we make sense of reciprocation. When we're provoked by an aggressive act, so if somebody gets aggressive with us, and I see this all over TikTok all the time now, is situations where someone is caught on camera behaving in a provocatively aggressive fashion. So they're shouting at people, or they're getting in their space, or they're hitting them, or they're touching them, something like that. Maybe they're saying really rude, horrible things. So what that means is you're being provoked with aggression. So what do you do in response? Sometimes people do reciprocate with an equal level of aggression, sometimes with more aggression than what they were provoked with. They're not likely to reciprocate, however, if they can be shown that the provocative behavior was not actually intentional, and if they can see that there were circumstances that help explain away why the person was behaving the way they were. Some additional research has looked at what are some of the situational clues in our context that are suggestive of aggressive scripts in our environment. So let me explain what I mean by aggressive scripts. Remember in the Bandura study where one of the toys that was in the playroom where the kids were playing was a toy gun. Well, it has a little suction cup bullet, quote unquote bullet. I had one of those toys when I was a kid. So did my brothers. We were always shooting them at each other. It was completely unsafe, but common. So some researchers were like, when we have exposure to imagery like that or objects like that, are those aggressive cues? Do they actually increase the likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior? So what do we know about that? In experimental setups, now let me be clear about what kind of aggressive behavior we're talking about in laboratory studies of aggression. We're not talking about hitting people, beating them up, kicking them, shooting them, cutting them with knives, nothing like that. None of that would be ethical. So what do we do to measure aggression in a laboratory? Usually it's by setting up a situation where the person is playing a game against someone else, and they are given an opportunity when they're provoked, when they're angry, to press a button that they believe is going to deliver an electric shock to their opponent. So when you have an angry subject who's been provoked, they have a choice. They can either push a button to shock someone, or they can refrain from doing so. In a room where there's a bunch of objects in the room, if one of those objects is a weapon, it can increase the level of aggression. So as you see on this graphic, it increased it by quite a lot in comparison to having a non-aggressive object like a badminton racket in the room. This is referred to as the weapons effect. When we are in a space where we are cued as to what a weapon might be, then that itself triggers, it makes accessible in memory aggressive ideas. And having those aggressive ideas accessible in memory makes us more likely to then act accordingly and behave in a way that's consistent with that. In addition to these more individual ideas about aggression, we can also look at institutional level examples of violence. Now, social psychologists have been somewhat less involved in this type of research. It's more common among sociologists and criminal justice researchers and criminologists. But we know that violence can actually occur in large cultural contexts, in addition to the way that violence can occur interpersonally. So you can have sort of a mass effect of callousness and indifference. A friend of mine called it becoming tolerant of intolerance. So aggression can actually occur at the institutional level, where the rules and structures and policies and procedures of an institution, of an organization, can actually function in such a way that they inflict harm on people. And often this takes the form of things like institutional policies that divide people up into different groups. So, you can have policies that make it more likely that certain groups of people are harmed by taking away their access to resources, harmed in terms of taking away their freedom, harmed in terms of putting their lives at risk, depriving them of access to food, and so on. So there's also that institutional level of aggression that you shouldn't forget about. Now, another type of theoretical model for helping us understand how and why aggression occurs is the fact that sometimes aggression works. Not that it's morally correct in all situations, but sometimes it gets us what we want. So what some philosophers as well as psychologists have argued is that for some people and in some cultural contexts, aggression is really utilitarian, meaning it serves a purpose. Now, certainly that's more accurate when you're talking about instrumental aggression, but it can also be related to hostile aggression. Your authors talk about deontological thinkers who say that there's some kind of absolute type of truth. So like you could have the value statement, thou shalt not kill, and that violating that is considered immoral. Utilitarian thinkers, on the other hand, say that moral decisions depend on what the outcomes are and what the situation was leading up to those outcomes. Some cultures tend to be more utilitarian in nature. Some cultures tend to be less so. Some religions tend to be more utilitarian. Others tend to be more deontological. And some individuals are more utilitarian, whereas some other individuals are more deontological. So this is another way of kind of thinking about individual differences as well as cultural differences in motives for aggression. One thing we know for sure, and this is whether you're talking about laboratory research or field research or just looking at the historical record, is that we are far more likely to behave aggressively toward people that we don't think are people. So people that we have dehumanized, we've taken away their full human status, we tend to feel more comfortable hurting them. So dehumanization is the process of denying other individuals their full humanity. We have a tendency to do this with people we identify as other or people we identify as the enemy. Now, when we're othering someone, we're saying they're not in our in-group, they're in our out-group. Not only are we less likely to help them, but we're also more likely to see them as less than fully human, see them as more animalistic. We may even use words that in our name calling that label them as animals. or insects, or refers to them as things like vermin or filth. So dehumanization is a way that we can, in some ways, justify the motive that we have for wanting to hurt other people, either by denying them access to things that they need, or by outright harming them, by chasing them down, by beating them up, by bullying them, by murdering them, by deporting them, and such things. Prejudice, it often involves dehumanization. So when we other people, when we put them in a category, and we have decided that they are people that we don't like, and we have stereotypes about them that are very negative, we often will amp that up by calling those people names that reflect their lack of full humanity. Now, how does dehumanization impact aggressive behaviors? When we are prejudiced in this particular way, and we detach ourselves from the sense that the people we're harming are actually people, it lowers our sort of border walls that kind of are guardrails, if you will, that keep us from engaging in antisocial behaviors. So when we dehumanize another person, what we're failing to do is empathize. So when you dehumanize, when you call people bugs or you call them filth, if you call them deplorable, what you're doing is saying they don't deserve my empathy, they don't deserve my kindness, they don't deserve my care or compassion. What they deserve is punishment. And therefore, people will go after that outgroup member that they have dehumanized, and they won't feel bad about it while they're doing it. An extension of this idea is something called compassion collapse. And what can happen is, especially if you're looking at large groups, as opposed to a single person, if you identify a large group of people, so in the current political climate, maybe it's immigrants, maybe it's poor people, maybe it's the wealthy, however you define the group that is the outgroup for you, and you have engaged in some kinds of dehumanization with that group, it's much easier to behave aggressively toward that group, either directly by doing things to harm people from that group, or institutionally or indirectly by just simply not providing resources or enacting laws or policies that outright harm those groups. What some researchers are calling this is the collapse of compassion, where you have lower and lower and lower levels of compassion when you feel completely powerless to deal with things like mass casualty events. So, for example, after you have big terrorist attacks in some situations, especially as they accumulate. So if people are watching news footage of Sudan, if they're watching news footage of Gaza, or news footage of the Ukraine rather, what they may see over time is that eventually just the accumulation of these, the horror of it can cause a collapse in your ability, your capacity for compassion, especially if you other those people, especially if you outgroup them. It's interesting, for instance, right now, that people in the United States are significantly more willing to express concern and care for the people of Ukraine than they are for the people of Sudan. And part of what's going on there is having more personal points of identification with the people of Ukraine and less awareness of, knowledge of, ways of finding personal connection with the people of Sudan. For example, of seeing the people of Sudan as being very, very, very different from us, and using that us-them language. When that happens, it can actually deflate any capacity you have for compassion. Then what you can do is actually turn that around and justify your lack of compassion. Remember our old friend cognitive dissonance. Since empathy is hard, empathy is work. So that there's a reason we call it empathy work. You have to make the effort to identify points of communion. You have to make the effort of allowing yourself to feel what other people are feeling. When you have these calamitous mass casualty events or these long-term wars, and we feel absolutely powerless and we don't identify with the people, then our ability to show compassion to them can just evaporate, because empathy is in fact hard to do. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 12.2.